Okay. Um, I can't see really all the people here, but I'm glad that some showed up. I don't know if you heard, but right now there's also another talk about how not to use microservices, which is also very important, but I'm glad you showed up here. I hope I don't disappoint anyone with that. Yeah, thank you for coming here. Before we go into the topic of configuration versus implementation, first of all, a little introduction. So my name is Daniel. I'm the CTO at CONTORION. And when I say that, I always have to ask, who has heard of CONTORION before? Quick hand sign. Okay, yeah, that row I know, but okay, not that many. Okay. Then maybe an even shorter introduction. CONTORION, we are a B2B e-commerce company. What we mainly do is we sell power tools and well, everything that small to medium businesses might need to fulfill their customers' needs on our website. So here a little screenshot from 4 weeks ago. Unfortunately, the Frühbucherrabatt is not valid anymore. So in case you needed a auto lawnmower, sorry. So what do we do in numbers? I think when you heard about Spryker some weeks or months ago, it was already mentioned, or it was mentioned all the time, that we are using an old version of Spryker, mainly due to the fact that we were founded in 2014. We were acquired by a slightly larger and a slightly older corporation last year, the Hoffmann Group. Until then, we already gathered, well, you can see the numbers. We gathered around 300,000 customers, most of which we acquired online. So we started as a pure digital and pure online player, but over time we also extended our business a bit to the, let's say, offline world by having a store in Steglitz, for example. The average age of our customer, who's mainly male, is 48 years. So we optimize our website a little bit for that age group. And if you take a look at it, it doesn't necessarily look like 2018 there, but it's the best for our customers, I hope. We still have a huge mobile traffic share, and we do offer all of our products well, over the website, obviously, and we've grown to a number of 170 employees over the past 4 years, with 30 people in engineering. And you all know that with more people in engineering, things like maintainability, sustainability get more and more important. That's one reason why we take a look into quality all of the time. And one major topic that we had was actually exactly configuration versus implementation. And I found this quote on the internet, this famous thing, saying that any fool can write code that a computer can understand. Good programmers write code that humans can understand. So especially if you take a look at larger tech teams, most of the time it's not about writing code that actually computer can parse. They are quite funny things that they can read any code, but users can't. And therefore, when we take a look at configuration versus implementation, we mainly want to make our coders, our tech people happy, and the business guys as well. So the big question that we ask, or that I want to tackle today, is how much time, or should I invest time into implementing a system that is highly configurable, or is it better to just leave it the way it is, or build a more stupid version? In that case, the things unfortunately aren't always white and black, so you will not get a definitive answer from me today, but maybe some ideas where your thoughts could lead you. So what we will have in this task is, in this talk, sorry, is an overview over the issues, the way we define configuration and implementation and the difference between those two, and a little story how we learned what was best for that specific use case in our system. What will not be in this talk is a golden hammer. As I said, I will not give an answer to that initial question, and what you definitely will not see is some examples for clean code. I try to, at least I tried to make the font as small as possible so you can't read any, but we'll see. Definition time. So I was trying to find good definitions for the terms configuration and implementation, and trust me, I browsed through a lot of pages, a lot of dictionaries tackling that. It was harder than I thought, and what I found I wasn't too happy with. Configuration, the free dictionary says it's the act of configuring a computer system. Cool. While implementation is this definition from Wikipedia, a realization of technical specification or algorithm as a program, software, yada, 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 also not very catchy in my opinion. So I try to come up with a definition, what's the difference that I want to talk about today, and the definition today are changing the behavior of an application by configuration means that I can influence how my software is operating without the need to change anything in the code. So no deployment, no line of code touched, no peer reviews, because I just changed the configuration, while by implementation is the exact opposite. In here, I would go through all of the necessary steps in software development to make sure that the code that we just changed is actually up to our quality standards. Configuration, don't get me wrong, there are some levels of configuration that I won't talk about today as they are just necessary. I mean, clean code and all of the other principles will basically tell you to not hard code any strings in your application, especially not the infrastructural or environmental configurations, like database connections or the URLs to microservices, time zones you operate in, and stuff like that. So, an example. And as I said, the code you will see now is not the best. I'm not a Python programmer, but this is what I could put together. So this, well, you know that one. It's hard-coded output. It's rather inflexible as it does serve only one purpose. It can only do this one task. But on the other side, if that was the task that you wanted to be fulfilled, then this code is probably the best you can get with. It fulfills the requirements of your product owners maybe, and it does exactly what it's specified to do. But we as programmers tend to make everything a little bit more flexible, a little bit more generic. So you could come up with a slightly different version where you say, okay, this output method has now one or two options or one or two logic blocks more, so that I can use it again and again with different outputs. Although in this case, I still hard code the actual message. So tendency, we do things even more flexible. We make it more generic, and therefore we could say, okay, when I issue this program from command line, I pass in what I wanted to output. As you can see, the code gets more and more complex, although a very simple example. And yes, I know there's no error handling. Bear with me there. The problem in this case is that it doesn't fulfill the original need anymore. I now, as a user, have the burden to provide the program with the input that I want it to output. So I could lift the burden a bit. I can add a configuration file, and that's where configuration finally comes in. I read this configuration, and I can configure like my default values or the values that I wanted to output. From this point on, I'm able to change configuration, and I don't have to take a look or open the software even and change how it behaves. I can just, well, let somebody else, it must not even be a programmer, change the configuration and it behaves differently. It still solves the original issue, but now it's more flexible and we can leave the coder out of it. What you could do now to get the maximum flexibility is you combine the two approaches that we just saw, and now full flexibility, and we are still able to output hello world. We have a lot of code now. We have the same configuration. We have, well, we have still the original method somewhere in here, but you can see that the original business case is only a small fraction of the code now. So big question is, was that really necessary? A story where we came up with this, or where we struggled with this, is actually one that is fundamental to our business model. In the background of, or behind the shop of Contorion, we have multiple merchants or vendors that do ship the products that our customers might want. So to give a little bit of context, we have basically 3 branches where we can get our products to the customers. One is directly drop shipping from wholesalers. So we just send a message saying that this customer just bought a product from yours and this is the delivery address, please send it over. The other part goes more or less directly via our warehouse, a third-party logistics provider, where we put things on stock, but we still send out the same message to that warehouse. It's not more than the task to send product A to customer B. And in the beginning, so in 2014, we were quite optimistic that, hey, it can't be that bad. There are multiple merchants out there. They all have their computer systems. You send them a message, and they send out the product. So when the first merchant came and we incorporated them into our systems, we thought, hey, cool. They have this default or this industry standard called Edifact. So we implement an Edifact exporter. We take our own stuff, we make it Edifact, and we send it to the merchant. We implemented a module, a very, very clean model that is able to take our data and transform it into a message. And the idea behind that was that if that one merchant uses an industry standard, then there might be others out there who also use that. We were right in that one. So there are multiple merchants. They all use kind of the same methodologies. And we were able to reuse our beautiful module. But what we didn't expect in the beginning was that we would add more and more formats, actually. So Edifact is updated twice a year. So it could be that a new merchant that we want to include actually uses a totally different version. And we might need to adapt our own Edifact exporter. It could also be that OpenTrans, which has been around for 10, 15 years now, is used with the, let's say, merchants that have come to the digital side of the business a bit later. So we noticed that over time we needed more and more formats. And the way we approached this, unfortunately, was that we would basically reuse the code that we had. As I said, I hope you can't read that, as that's actually not the best part of our system. But here you can see that for the first, I think it's 9 merchants or something, we really hard-coded the export formats into our system. So when we saw that a product needs to be exported to merchant A, then we would load that specific part of the code. And you can get a very short overview here. That means that we have to change like 6 files or something per merchant. How does the code look inside there? Again, it's not about the code, but the complexity and the size. So this is parts of the code of an Edifact exporter. This over here is the strategy, how we want to export something, while this is building a part of the message. Keep that code in mind. We will see it again later. But overall, what we realized after a while is that this is just madness. We would have developers having the task to introduce new merchants into the system. It would take a while. we would basically copy an older implementation of the format that we need now and change just some lines of code because there was some ominous field that the new merchant needs and the other didn't. We would deploy this, we would then test this on our staging systems, we would send the messages to the merchants. So it was a lot of back and forth, and overall it was not very maintainable. The time to market in general was also something where the business guys in our company were not too happy about, as sometimes it took 3 to 4 weeks before we could get a new merchant on board. And this was more or less what we felt in this whole area. And funnily enough, the service that we built afterwards we called Quentin. It's not related to that picture. No. So what was our new approach? The new approach was basically that we took a step back and looked at what is it actually that we want to solve. We were still in the middle of bringing new merchants on board every now and then, sometimes 2 a week, sometimes, I don't know, 4, depending on how fast our business departments would negotiate contracts. And we decided that this madness that I talked about needs to stop. So we came up with a new plan and said that most of the time the things that we do are not that different. And we can hopefully reuse most of the code, but maybe change the configuration or introduce configurations where we are able then to basically move out the differences into configuration files instead of in the code. And the way we did that was that we separated this whole mechanic of exporting into a separate service called Quentin. And we would say that the shop itself would only send out one kind of message towards that service. We came up with our own implementation of one of the industry standards, which we extended to take basically all of the fields, everything that we know about a product and about the order that we are about to send to one of the merchants, and would send that one to Quentin. Quentin itself then has a configuration file. So we decided that in theory the process is always the same. We would always take the data, would generate an export file, would archive it somewhere for debugging or for the business side to generate invoices or whatever. And then we would send it over to the merchant. The way of transport is also quite limited. It could be an FTP or an email address or standards, basically. So we thought that all of this configuration can be put into a configuration file, and we just implement those ways of transporting once and reuse it every time we need. We solved the issue of the different file formats by introducing a templating engine. So we got rid of all this code that we have. We decided to just drop it, as we didn't really need a wrapper around a text file that we would just generate to send it over, because we were not interested in the file itself. We would just generate whatever our merchant wants to read, and then we send it over. So it's a one-shot. We generate something, send it out, that's it. So we thought a templating engine is exactly made for that. We take data, we generate something, and we export it. So how does the config file look like now? It is quite simple, as you can see here. We basically just describe what's the type of the export file. So the format in this case, for example, would be edifact. With some merchants, we had the problem that the encoding was important. Okay, so different merchants, different encodings, we would add that also here. And then, as you can see, we added the template. We would just reference it here. We'll see it later. And this is basically where then the magic will happen. The connection, how do we transport it away, and file name convention, and last but not least, the path on the FTP server where to put it to. So this is basically comparable to the code that we saw earlier, where we would have the export strategy and the transport strategy put into this overall export model, and then code happens. In this case, we are a bit more flexible, and in this case also our business analysts and our product managers can read the config file and see what did we define with that merchant. That's now part of one of the templates. I hope there are some PHP guys here, so you recognize Twig, I hope. We literally took Twig as our templating engine and said, we use it on our front end, we use it in our back end partially, so why not use it for that part also? And this output here basically is one line of one of the export files. And if you compare it to what we had earlier, this is literally the same output as this code that we had before. And as I said, the code on the right-hand side we would copy over and over again, depending on what the merchant needs. What are the benefits of that? And what does follow after that one? We came to a point where we could say, okay, a new merchant, not a big deal. We don't need any implementation, as the generic file generation process was finished, the transport was done, archivation of a file was done. We just need to distinguish this template is for that merchant, and the FTP server configuration is different, maybe. Developer happiness increased a lot. Suddenly, with putting this into production, people stopped complaining about the export process. We still have the old ones. We didn't migrate them over, at least not all of them. But no one is complaining anymore about that one. So that's a plus. From the business side, we were able now to speed up the integration process. We don't need to write tickets to developers. We don't need to go through code review processes and everything. But integration was merely a point of writing the template and configuring the export. Which also means, in the old world, this would never have worked. As you saw, we had specific classes, specific models for producing edifact files. We had specific models for producing OpenTrans, for XML, for anything that we would need to export. But in this case, whatever we output doesn't matter. It's as long as it's a text file that we produce, we can use our templating engine and do whatever weird format somebody needs, we can just generate it. And that's also something to do with developer happiness. In the end, it should be possible that product managers can take over configuring the file. I just saw that there's a word missing. But product managers should be able to configure that one, as they are also the ones who are in discussion with the merchants. So everything was good. Or is it? Business side. Developer happiness sometimes has this weird level, or this weird combination with business, as business is happy even when developers aren't, and the opposite. We need to find the right balance there. So a short number example. In the beginning, it was quite elaborate to introduce a new merchant into our system. I picked a random number, and that's the chart here. This was the effort, basically, that it took us for each and every merchant to introduce. Building this configurable system, of course, is not without any cost. So we had some people working on that for quite a while, and let them develop everything while just integrating one new merchant as the first use case for that. So this one merchant took a hell of a lot of time compared to the other approach. But after that, integration of new merchants in the future should go faster. That was the idea behind it. So this chart more or less shows a break-even point from an effort perspective, with those random numbers that I chose. So in this case, as the ratio that's there, basically it says that after the 7th merchant that we would integrate after having the system, we would finally pay off in effort. So those 7 merchants we at first have to find. I mean, everything's beautiful now, the code is clean and everybody's happy, but maybe we don't have those 7 merchants anymore. Maybe we change our business model and we don't go there. So maybe all this was for nothing. Gladfully, in our case, it wasn't, but we didn't know at the moment we built it. So what are the open to-dos for us right now? Right now, I lied a little bit. The configuration that we save or that we put to the system is actually part of the code repository. So even if product managers are able to configure the system, it's still necessary that a developer deploys this into production. We would add, or would be needed to add, another 50% of the implementation time that we already invested to make it possible that then finally no developer is involved into sending a new merchant to production anymore. But the big question is, again, does it pay off? I don't know if you're familiar with this chart. It's supposed to be funny, but I actually have it over my desk and always take a look at it whenever I think about, do we have the time or the necessity to automate something? And what this chart tells us basically is that if we can shave off 1 day of our time in automating stuff, then if we did that task where we save the 1 day once a month, then we would have 8 weeks time to automate it before it pays off after 5 years. So at one point, it doesn't really pay off anymore to invest more time into making it even more flexible to shave off just a few hours anymore. If we could save 6 hours every week, we could invest 2 months. So if we just took, I don't know, a week to implement it, we would save and save on our efforts in total. But that's not given in our case. And if we did that without looking at this chart, then probably our business guys would not be too happy. As IT, as we understand it, is not there just to be IT or just to produce code or a beautiful system, but in our case, we want it to actually serve a business purpose. So we always take those considerations. So I'm a bit fast, but conclusions. Having this configurable system actually helped us in having more maintainable code. We only had just 1 code for generating the file. We had just 1 code for exporting to an FTP server. And this was easily testable. We just needed to do it once and we don't touch it anymore. And in general, the whole system is now more flexible than before. Building it, though, we had to invest a lot. It now is a bit more complex, as the configuration actually has an influence on where to go to. You can't just follow the code anymore like before when it was hard-coded. But you have to take all the detours in the code when you actually read the configuration to follow it along. And the decision, just like I said, it should be based on how much time you can actually save in implementing this versus going for the rather crude, hard-coded way and saving that complexity, basically. So before I come to an end, I just want to give you some questions on your way. The next time you may be in a situation where you need to think about, okay, do I go this path along and go for the extra clean code where everything is configurable, although it might not pay off. So one of the questions is, how often does something change? What we realized over the past 4 years, when we finally were at a point where a merchant was attached to our systems, then the format doesn't change anymore. So initially, it was super helpful to have the code or the configuration file there, but once it's done, it barely changes. How much do the things that you want to configure have in common? In our case, it was quite obvious, as this was part of just one process. But maybe, I don't know, if you have a more complex use case, it could be that the use cases are so different that a configuration file might not be the right option for that. How many users do you have is actually also important. If you think about things like, I don't know, a Symfony framework or SAP, of course, you are a software vendor with a huge user base. You need to be able to let them configure something. But in our case, the only users were we ourselves. So this configuration or the configuration options were just for us. Will you stay in control of your configuration? Thinking about Apache or any other web server system, of course, they have their one implementation, and then you add, I don't know, hundreds of configuration options to make it behave the way you want on your production systems. But no one at the Apache Foundation is in control over the configurations that are out there. So you add a lot of code into your system, or they would need to add code into their system, just to be able to cope with all of the different configuration files that people throw at the system. In case you ever had to debug Apache when you misconfigured it, the error messages have gotten way better, but I'm pretty sure that this was a huge effort to make those error messages readable for users. And last but not least, obviously, how long would it take to implement this? If you, just like I showed with the chart, if you get all of your use cases done by implementing a simpler system without all of this configuration overhead, then maybe just do it. That's already what I wanted to tell you. My contact detail, in case you're a spammer, please take the second email address. Otherwise, just drop me a mail in case you should have any questions. Or I think we have enough time for questions right now. Thank you. There's one. Okay. Sorry, acoustics. This way they are great, I assume, but the other way it doesn't really.
I think it's better now.
Yeah, well, super.
Can you also comment your testing procedures? Because as a developer, I would not be totally happy with this configuration in files because it's not testable, and you will need more integration tests instead of unit tests.
Well, what you can do from a unit testing perspective, you can go directly into the code which actually is dependent on one or two of those configuration options. So you should have a method that behaves a certain way when you add, I don't know, the config file name or the template file name. But in the end, obviously, yes, an integration test is way more powerful in this case. The idea with an integration test is also what we thought is the most helpful way to let our product managers implement a new file for a new merchant. So an idea that we didn't implement as of now is actually that we would add kind of an integration testing framework with a quick output for our non-developers so that they could throw a configuration file at it and just check if the system behaves correctly from two different perspectives at least. Does that answer your question?
Yes, but I still think there's the danger of introducing bugs into your system without changing a single line of code.
Yeah. That's given with the configuration file. So in that case, two thoughts come through my head right now. One is, of course, if the user base for those configuration changes is very, very small, you can have a proper training for them and tell them these are the correct options that do work. On the other hand, if the user base gets larger, then you would need to add a lot of code to verify that the settings that you gave to the system actually match up and don't produce an error in production. So checking for invalid values or checking if files do exist that are referenced. Checking if, I don't know, some formatting options do work based on the configuration. But yeah, testing is, again, a bit more complex than if you just wrote the code as a one-go solution.
Thank you very much.
Other questions? Sorry.
Did you notice any other hidden costs with this change from code to configuration? For example, you improved the time to market for introducing new merchant, but I assume that is not the only change you might want to make. And did it make other kinds of changes much more difficult, for example?
Actually, not that I'm aware of. Of course, I mean, there are some things you can't measure. So developer happiness is a gut feeling that we have. Because people stop complaining, we assume that they are no more happy about it. Testing, as we just heard, of course, is a bit more complex. Although we are now able to basically put in some configuration files and check if the output by using those configuration files is correct again. But other hidden costs, I didn't really see. No. But
okay,
it's one specific use case. And it has its ups and downs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Did you consider using like a standard tool or online service that maybe is like already established in the retail industry?
Yeah, we actually had some discussions with providers of software that would handle I don't know, kind of a message bus with included templates or promises like, oh, we can solve all of your communication issues. But when we took a deeper look into those systems, they were either way too complex, where we were then in configuration hell again, or they wouldn't suit our technology stack. So one of the best candidates for that was unfortunately written in a language where we would have no control over. So we decided to not follow that path. And most of those systems actually are either transaction-based in pricing or in monthly or yearly fees. So we thought that with the power that we have in our development team, it's easier and in the long run cheaper for us to implement this small solution on our own.
Okay, thank you.
No more questions? Okay, then thank you very much for your attention and have fun at the rest of the day, I guess.